I can't just be a bystander and watch this on television. I need to be a part of it. I need to do something to make that change that's needed. And that is when I decided to join the resistance. I mean, it wasn't directly tied into like the fact that it wasn't like an issue that I want to follow, in my parents' footsteps, but it eventually became that. But the start of it, or that spark for me, was, I guess, seeing myself as someone who can be an agent for change and being one of those who creates that change and putting that responsibility, I guess, on my own shoulders.
Welcome to Lessons from Living. I am your host, Beth Graham, and I'm delighted you are with me today. What is it like to dedicate your life to a cause? Zolal Habibi knows. For 26 years, she has served within the Iranian resistance, promoting the cause of a free and democratic Iran. If you don't know much about Iran and wonder why it's so important, you're about to receive an education. Let's go. Well, welcome, Zalal, to Lessons from Living. We're so happy to have you with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you, and please allow me to greet those who are tuning in today.
Yes. I first want to understand your story just a little better. You had said that your parents moved to the U.S. before the Iranian Revolution. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that where you were born then?
Yes, I was born in D.C.
Oh, wow. Okay. Are you a U.S. citizen then?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
I was
Just
born and
curious.
raised. Yeah, born and raised in the D.C. area.
Okay. That's neat. Well, your father was targeted when you were very young, it sounds like, and was killed ultimately by the regime when you were just 7. Why was he targeted?
Well, my father was a prominent writer and a human rights activist, and so since 1981, especially with the start of the mass executions in Iran, he was a very vocal voice against the regime and in trying to bring to the attention of the international community, but also the Iranians at that point, because, I mean, it's back in the 1980s, early 1980s, there wasn't much communication. A lot of people weren't even aware that these things were happening inside of Iran. So my father and many others, they were those who were bringing this to the attention of the international community and the world at large, that such crimes are being perpetrated by the regime.
Okay. That had to be a terrible but transformative experience for you. So young.
Yes, I was only 7 at the time. So, and also because my father was a writer, he tended to be home more than my mom was growing up. So I was very attached to my father. So that was a major blow, I guess, understandably for any child, but because I also had that connection with my dad. But I think that the fact that I had been introduced to the human rights situation in Iran at such an early age, I guess it wasn't a major shock to me
Hmm.
in comparison, just because I knew so many others who had gone through similar things. And I knew so many others, I had so many other friends who had lost a parent or both parents, or friends who actually had, you know, spent time in prison with their parents. So seeing those things and knowing those people, it just put things into different perspective. And at the end of the day, I actually considered myself to be one of the lucky ones, because I never had to live under those circumstances. I just knew about those circumstances, but I never had to live through them. And I also understood, I guess, that my father died for something he believed in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, knowing that he had a purpose in his life, even though I was a child, I understood that. And that's why I could truly honestly say I've never had any like regrets, or I have had moments of like, what if,
Yeah, sure.
like if he was around, what would he tell me? Or like what
Mhm.
impact would it have made in my personal life or whatnot? But I've never had like those moments of like regret that I wish he hadn't chosen this path in his life, or, you know, we could have just had a normal life like everyone else. I've never had that because I've always taken pride in the path that my parents chose. And I think that they were, an inspiration to me growing up. And they were like the best role models I could ever want because they taught
Mhm.
me what's important in life, not through their words, but through their own actions. And it's interesting for me. I mean, even to this day, it's been 37 years since my father was killed, practically. And to this day, I meet people, random people that I don't know. They come and approach me and they're like, "Are you so and so's daughter?" And I'm like, "Yes, I am." And they tell me, your father impacted our lives so greatly. And it's like through different generations. Like, I've had people younger than me come and tell me this. I've had people from previous older generations come and tell me this. So it goes beyond, the generations and also beyond borders, people from in different countries. And the fact that even though he was only 36 when he was killed, he was able to make that much of an impact on people's lives. I think that is something that's commendable, and it's not something that happens every day.
Right, and certainly inspired you. Was he here when he was killed then, or was he in Iran?
No, no, he was actually working on a book, and he
Mhm.
was in the border area of Iran and Iraq at that time,
Okay.
helping, refugees and, just in the border area of Iran and Iraq where there was, fighting between the regime and opposition and so. So he was killed in end of July 1988.
Okay. And explain how you made the decision then to join the resistance. I'm sure that was part of the inspiration behind it, but explain how that happened.
Well, first, I think I have to explain something else that happened before that, and then I'll
Go right
get into
ahead.
that. After my father was killed, my mom had to make like a decision in her life, like what are we going to do, or what is she going to do, I guess.
Mhm.
And she decided to join the Iranian resistance herself. At the time, my mom was 25, and with two small children, I was 7, my brother was 3, and you know, we packed up and went from Washington to Iraq because that's where the Iranian resistance was at that time.
Wow.
And so that was like a major shift, but it was like the best years of our lives practically, despite being at a very difficult time in our lives. And then when the first Gulf War happened, it wasn't very safe to have children there. So my mom decided to send me and my brother back to the US and where we were raised by my aunt. But she decided to stay and continue to fight. And I've thought about that moment, that, and that choice like many, many times. And I have so much respect for her for doing that because the easiest path would have been, we've done our part, let me go and attend to my children and, go back to the US. But she chose a path of making a sacrifice for the freedom of Iran and putting something that's, I guess, a goal that's much larger than ourselves before her own family and before herself. And so, yeah, so me and my brother grew up back in Virginia with my aunt. And, we just had like our normal lives and going about our studies. And I don't know how many Iranians you know, but for us, like, education is a major issue in Iranians. Everyone is expected to become either like a doctor, engineer, lawyer. Nothing below that is practically accepted in our community. But so, we grew up with this notion that you guys have to study, you have to become something because it'll be your generation's responsibility to rebuild Iran once it's freed.
Mhm.
And so that was the path that I was on. I had gotten a full scholarship to go and study. I was going to pursue medicine, actually, ophthalmologist. And at the summer that I graduated from high school was the summer of 1999. And at that time, in July of that year, so a few weeks after graduation, student uprisings broke out in Iran. And that was the first time in over a decade that like a major uprising was forming in Iran. And especially after the first time after the 1988 massacre, where 30,000 people were executed in 5, 6 weeks. And it was also the first time that it was being broadcasted live because it was the start of cable television and CNN and cable news. And so the world was seeing these scenes for the first time. And, I remember watching these scenes of, students being thrown over buildings and, the brutality of the regime. And I kept on thinking to myself, I can't just be a bystander and watch this on television. I need to be a part of I need to do something to make that change that's needed. And that is when I decided to join the resistance. I mean, it wasn't directly tied into like the fact that it wasn't like an issue that I want to follow, in my parents' footsteps, but it eventually became that. But
Mhm.
the start of it, or that spark for me, was, I guess, seeing myself as someone who can be an agent for change and
Yeah.
being one of those who creates that change and putting that responsibility, I guess, on my own shoulders. I remember back then, the year before, I had ran into a article that was printed in like a youth magazine, and which is published in LA back then. It was Farsi, and in it, it had an article. It said, there are over 20,000 Iranian doctors in the US. And this is back in like 1998. Right now, I think it's like probably 2 or 3 times more. And I thought to myself, am I going to be one of those 20,000? Or am I going to do something for these 20,000 to come and be able to serve their own people finally? And I mean, that still is true today because Iran has the greatest brain drain in the world. If you look at practically all Fortune 500 companies, or all major, like in the tech world, if you look in, I don't know, like institutes like NASA, you see that there are Iranians in like the top positions there.
Hmm.
you know, they're not able to serve their own people, but they really have made an impact in the world. And just imagine if those assets, I think the true asset, or the true, I guess, treasure of Iran is its people. Just imagine if they were able to serve their own people in their own country and to be able to build, that true democracy that they want to see.
Yes. Can you give us, just to help us envision this, a picture of what life has been like for the Iranian people during this reign of this regime?
Unfortunately, this run of terror has continued for 47 years now. But even before that, mm, it wasn't, ideal. We went from a classical dictatorship to a theocracy, which is far worse. So unfortunately, the people of Iran have been fighting for freedom and against dictatorships for 120 years now, actually. So this has been a continuous fight. Unfortunately, we've only had like a 2 year, somewhat democratic government, and that was under when Dr. Mossadegh was chosen by the people of Iran as the prime minister. And that was very short lived because of the 1953 coup d'etat against Dr. Mossadegh, which was carried out by the CIA and MI6. So, unfortunately, in the last 47 years, I mean, life has been tainted with, war, destruction, executions, systematic suppression, especially of women, of ethnicities, of religious minorities. I don't think there is any part of daily life or even issues that you could put your finger on that haven't been completely destroyed by this regime. Over 120,000 people have been executed for fighting for freedom, or for opposing this regime over these years, and that's aside from the thousands of people who were killed actually this January in the uprisings. And this has been a continuous cycle from, 1981 till today. And you see so many parallels in regards to what the regime did then and what they're doing now. So the people of Iran have really lived under very, very difficult circumstances. A lot of the youth that you speak to right now, they say, we're alive, but this isn't life. We're not living, we're just breathing. And I mean, Iran has a very young population. I think over 70% are under the age of 30.
Wow.
And it is a very well-educated society. I mean, most people have, I think Iran has one of the highest rates of, college education. And what's interesting is that you see more female students in the across universities in Iran than you do male. And it's not that there's positive discrimination for women, it's that they see it as a form of resisting against
Hmm.
this misogynist regime. So women of Iran have been using every, aspect in society to be able to resist in face of this regime. And this is something that from day one has been continuing till today. And that's why you see that resilience and that defiance that has become part of the culture. So yeah, I mean, every aspect of it, if you look at Iran's, unfortunately, the infrastructure. So if you look at the environment, everything has been destroyed by this regime over these years. And that's because the regime can only keep its grip on power through, death and destruction,
Mhm.
by spreading fear in society, by through its warmongering and spread of, fundamentalism and, their ideology, which has unfortunately had major effects in the world and especially in the region. But I think one thing that's very important to understand is that the people of Iran have never given in completely to this regime. So, I mean, there are a lot of dictatorships around the world, but a lot of times you see that society give in to that status quo. The people of Iran have never given in.
Mhm.
And we see a organized resistance forming from onset, but especially since June 20th, 1981, which was a turning point. And that was about, less than 2 years after the 1979, actually 2 years after the 1979 revolution. Khomeini opened fire on peaceful protests of 500,000 people in Tehran. And that was like a turning point in the fight against this regime. And that's when the National Council of Resistance of Iran was actually formed in July 1981.
Okay.
Because
Well,
from
I
then they
do wanna
realized they
talk
have to overthrow the regime. Yeah.
I do wanna talk about the resistance, but I wanted to ask you, you had said that the governments have not been willing to hold a firm policy against Iran because they are the number one state sponsor of terror. Everyone is afraid of them and their proxies. They have a hit list, I heard you say. Does it encourage you that the US was willing to finally say enough is enough? I know you didn't want the intervention, but do you at least like that they're stepping up to try to help?
Well, I think it's you have to look at like the bigger picture and like maybe a bit before and after. This is also in history. This has been repeated many times. Let's just look at like World War II as an example. The policy of appeasement was pushed forward to such extent that finally reached a point that there was no other way than going into war. We have been warning about this for over 2 decades, 22 years ago, actually, since Rajabi first spoke about this in the European Parliament, where she said, the solution to Iran is neither war nor appeasement. It's to support the people of Iran and their organized resistance to bring about change. And the reality is that she also emphasized there that, look, the policy of appeasement will finally reach a war if you don't do something about it. And the reality is that, I mean, the intervention that was, carried out since February 28th, from day one, it wasn't because of the people of Iran. It was because of Iran's nuclear ambitions and its missile programs and its meddling in the region. It has made the regime weaker, but
Mhm.
is the regime going to be overthrown this way? No.
Mm.
Is the regime going to use this war to the extent that it can? Yes, because this regime strives on more. That is why it started, the Iran-Iraq war. It was dragged out for 8 years. It could have ended with after 2 years, but Khomeini said war is a holy matter for us because it creates a atmosphere that allows the regime to suppress more
Mm.
extensively. Because they could say, look, we have a foreign enemy, so you need to stay quiet. So you need to be responsive to the regime.
Mhm.
And that is exactly what it's doing right now. I mean, right now, unfortunately, there has been this internet blackout for 31 days now in Iran. But if you look at the reports or things that are coming out, they have set up checkpoints like across the whole country Like, for instance, they say if you wanna drive, like, a 30-minute distance, you have to go through at least 2 or 3 checkpoints, where they're not only checking your car, they take your phone, they check your phone, they check who you were in contact with, what apps you have, do you have internet connection, and how is this internet connection being provided? Because there's a, blackout, so
Right.
you're probably using, like, a VPN or a proxy or whatever. So this is allowing the regime to take con you know, enter every aspect of people's personal lives and control them. And also we're seeing the executions. I mean, just in the past 10 uh, practically a week, or in 10 days, there were 10 political prisoners and protesters who were executed.
Mhm.
And this is Ajay, the head of the judiciary. Actually, 2 days ago, he came to the scene and he said, "We need to expedite the executions of the protesters." So, under how are they justifying it? With the war. And
Mhm.
also, they know that when there's a war, when there's bombs over the head, people can't come and protest or do anything. And also, the international community, because they are so concentrated on the war, no one's going to, not a word of condemnation has come out from a government in regards to this new wave of political executions. And
Yeah, I did want to mention, you said that it wasn't the people who were the issue. I take issue with that a little bit because I think they use the excuse of the proliferation, but Trump was under a lot of pressure to respond to all of those executions. I don't know if he knew the best way to accomplish that, but I mean, I know that that weighed very heavy on him, and I think the people do care about that. I've been a little bit disappointed with the fact that there's not more response than there has been from, status quo Americans that this is just not acceptable, in any country. But I just wanted to mention that 'cause,
of
I
course,
think we
I think that there was when it comes to the people, and even, like, for instance, uh, different entities, like, for instance, members of Congress, or, a lot of people have voiced their solidarity with the people of Iran, and they have stood by the people of Iran. And that's not something that we don't see, or we don't take into consideration.
good.
We see that, and we understand that. And I think that actually, every time that there is an uprising in Iran, in fact, you do see that popular support and people, supporting standing by the people of Iran. The thing is that due to the policy of appeasement, there are certain things that you just see, and then you have to learn to read between the lines too. And as Iranians, and especially Iranians who are members of the resistance, we've learned to read between the lines. Because it's one thing to, give your words of condemnation. It's another, like, how are you going to pursue with the regime? Like, for instance, even right now, I mean, the president has made clear a few times that, you know, the regime, as far as we're concerned, has changed because Khamenei is gone and it's now Mojtaba who will be, taking his place. Or the fact that, they're looking to be able to, I guess, just see change in regards to Iran's international relations. The issue of the people of Iran have to be able to do that. And I think that is something that we actually believe in ourselves too, that the people of Iran have to take their destiny into their own hands and create the change they want to see, because
Mhm.
we also have a history here. If you look in the last 100 years, all of the dictators that we've had have been installed. It's not what has come from the people of Iran.
Right.
The people of Iran revolted in 1979 against the Shah, and they were able to throw out the Shah. But unfortunately, it was the Cold War era. From a few months before the revolution, the international community was realizing that the Shah is on his last foot, and they started discussing what comes next, because Iran plays a very important role geopolitically. It was located, neighboring the USSR, and this was at a time that Afghanistan was being taken over by the USSR. So there was, a lot of things going on in that region at that time. And, you know, for the international community, they started saying, well, what are we going to allow the progressive movements, which have created this revolution, actually take over? Or do we have another option that is more, that we could, trust more in regards to that they won't be aligned with the USSR? And that's why, unfortunately, they decided to go with Khomeini, because he was a cleric. He was opposed to USSR and communism. And so they thought, and he also made a lot of promises. He promised that
Mhm.
there will be freedoms would be granted in Iran. He didn't want to have anything to do with power. He would come and go to Qom and continue his studies once the government takes off. And, these promises, empty promises that were made. And
Sure.
unfortunately, he was brought in. So the Iranian people have that experience both with the Shah, Reza Khan, and then Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. All of them, they were installed,
Mhm.
and then Khomeini. So that's why the Iranian people, they just want to take their destiny into their own hands. What they're
Yeah.
asking for is like, we don't want troops on the ground. We're not asking for financial support. We're just asking for the pulse of appeasement to end, and
Mhm.
to recognize the people's right to resist and to fight back
Yes.
against this regime. Because as the world is seeing, this regime is not going to go away by itself. I mean, it's very brutal. It'll
Right.
fight till the last, you know,
Well,
house.
that is a question. You mentioned a potential new leader. That was it's been one of the biggest surprises to me is that as hard as we've hit them militarily and as many leaders as we have been able to take out, it seems like there's still someone in charge and there's still shooting guns and they're still responding. So it just seems like, to use a sporting analogy, their bench is very deep.
Yeah. That is exactly what one of the reasons that we've always said that war wasn't the solution, aside from an issue of like principle or values, not wanting war, because war brings destruction. War has, you know, it has the collective impact that it makes on any society. I mean, that's a
Sure.
given. And the fact that it does have casualties, and it has civilian casualties, it has infrastructure casualties. Aside from that aspect of it, even if you look at it from completely like a military perspective, Iran is very different from a lot of other countries in the region. And it's also very different from a classical dictatorship. Like, for instance, in Iran, when the Shah escaped, within 3 weeks, the regime was gone. Actually, less than 3 weeks. He left on December 16th or 17th, and February 11th, the revolution was completed. So in 3 weeks, because it was a classical dictatorship. So when you move the head, it collapses, the whole system falls. But this regime is a theocracy that's more complex, because it's supposed to be a republic. So it has structure, it has this apparatus in place. When you remove the head, they just replace the head. So, like, Khomeini died, Khamenei replaced him. Khamenei died, his son has now been chosen to replace him. It is a backtracking for the regime in itself, the fact that they've made it hereditary, even though they're supposed to be a republic and they're supposed to be opposed to the Shah, which was calling for a hereditary line. But
Mhm.
even in that sense, it still does have that. I mean, it has their whole systems, and their IRGC is still there. The systems are still there, and they're working. And the reality is, after the 12-day war, the regime realized that this might come, this day. And so since then they had been planning for this situation. So they actually, that's why you see within like the first 2-3 days of the war, they emptied out all of their major bases, and they've been working on the ground, but they actually had those systems in place and intact. The Revolutionary Guards were told, each unit or whatever, they had been given specific lists, like, if worst comes to worst and a war starts or whatever, you fire at these countries, you do this, you do that. And so
Mm.
that's why they're able to continue, even though like the heads of that system have been eliminated. So it's very important to understand like how this regime works. And right now the regime is also playing both the victim card and the hero card in the Middle East. Or not only just in the Middle East, I guess, in the international community. So they know how to use these because, as I said, this regime strives on more. This is how it has been able to. I mean, Khamenei, about 10 years ago during the Arab Spring, there was this quote from him. He said, "If because people were questioning him, like, why are we fighting in Syria? Like, what does Bashar Assad have to do with us? Why are we doing? The country is already in a bad financial situation with all the sanctions and everything. So why are we doing this?" And he said, "If we don't fight on the streets of Syria, Baghdad, Lebanon, we're going to have to fight in the streets of Tehran, Shiraz, and Isfahan. Because until when we have all of this crisis in the region, the attention doesn't come on the people of Iran. But the minute there's no crisis, everyone's going to start concentrating on the situation of the people inside of Iran, and that is what's going to bring the overthrow of this regime. So this is something that the regime has been preparing for a long time, and that's why it makes it different. Also, Iran, when you look at it from a geographic perspective, Iran is a very large country. It's about 3 times the size of Iraq, 4 times the population. We have mountain ranges, we have deserts, we have very crowded metropolitan areas. We have jungles, we have the ocean and like the sea. So that makes it very difficult to plan like military intervention. So it's usually over, with airplanes and whatnot and bombs.
Mhm.
That's not going to overthrow a regime at the end of the day. So this is something that the regime knows, and the regime knows that the Western powers know this too. And that is something that, anyone who has like a bit of military understanding of like strategy and whatnot, they understand that this was never a possibility really to have the
Mhm.
regime completely overthrown with foreign intervention unless you have boots on the ground, and that's even not very likely because of the geography.
Okay. If there are people positioned to kick off a revolution, what do you think they're waiting for at this point? It seems like this is as weak as the regime has been in a long time. What is your sense there?
I think that if we look at how things were coming about from January till now, you would see the line of the direction. The reality is that, as I mentioned in the past month, because there has been a war 40 days now, when you have bombs over your head, you can't do anything underground, especially with all of this complete martial law and checkpoints and everything that the regime has put in place. But one of the things that, if you look, like for instance, January after the uprising and the brutal suppression and the thousands of people who were killed, 50,000 people were arrested, detained. And there was a 19-day internet blackout. And that is how the regime was able to take control of the narrative that is being fed and what gets out of the country, what doesn't get out of the country, and how it can control, society. After that 19 days, when the internet connected, we started seeing those images of like the body bags, and the mass killings. If you look, there's a lot of parallels to 1980s. This is exactly the same method that they used. Like back then, we actually have images of like newspapers from back then that it says, you know, would the parents of these children come and identify their bodies? They've been executed. We don't even know their names. And then there would be like pictures of, all these teenage girls who were executed. There is a newspaper that we have. It says 200 children executed in one night. And you see among them children as young as 14, 15 years old who were executed overnight, by the regime. So I know people who, like, for instance, were in prison back then. They were teenagers in 1981, in July 1981. They said every single night we would count the coup de graces that were fired, and they would count about 200, 300 coup de graces just in Evin prison and just in one prison in Tehran. So the regime has that experience, and that's how it was able to spread complete fear in society. It wanted to repeat that. Back then, they would charge families for the bullets used. Now they're charging families for the bullets used. So it's a lot of the
Mm.
same mechanisms are being used by the regime. But it backfired this time around because the people of Iran had the experience of the 1980s. Of 1981, they had the experience of 1988 massacre. this is an issue that, especially in recent years, has gotten a lot of attention inside of Iran, and people are aware of it now. And so people knew that, look, the regime is doing this to spread fear. So they decided that, look, if you look in the last decade, we've had 4 major uprisings in Iran. Every time there's a spark, people come to the streets. Then there's a brutal, suppression. Over 1,000 people are killed, and then the regime is able to push people into their homes until the next spark. They realize this time around, we can't allow that to happen. We need to continue, even though the cost is very high. But it's not going to change unless we pay that price and we bring that change about. So what you saw is like those ceremonies that people were holding for their loved ones who had been killed, they turned to scenes of defiance. And this has like a back history for it too. But for instance, there's in our culture we hold ceremonies for the 40th day of people when they are killed. Those ceremonies all turned to forms of defiance and resistance, and people started celebrating the lives of those who had been killed instead of mourning, or like, of course they were mourning, but instead of, I guess, drowning in their sorrows, kind of
Yes.
way. And they started making pledges to continue the fight. You see a lot of the videos that surfaced after people died that they had left their final farewells. They had said their final farewells with their families. They had left messages saying, look, I might not come back, but please continue. And I
Mhm.
think that was like the momentum in Iran society. And we saw actually February 22nd, so 1 week before the start of the war, universities classes resumed, because since January and the suppression, the crackdown on the protests, all universities, all classes, all campuses were closed, and everything was being done online. So all classes were remote. The day that classes were supposed to resume in person was February 22nd. Protests started that day in universities across Iran. So the minute students got back, they started the protest. The regime tried to crack down. It was like 3-4 days of continuous, skirmishes between the people and the regime. They tried to cut off, the university students from the people who were outside for this protest not to rise. There was still martial law in place throughout the city. So we were seeing that happen. On February 23rd, we saw resistance units carry out an operation against the headquarters of Khamenei, which is the most secure location in all of Iran. And this was 5 days before the start of the war. So when they were at the heightened security,
Mhm.
because they knew that the war was coming. And they have about 8,000 security forces just surrounding this compound.
We're going to take a pause in this interview and we'll reconvene next week to hear Zolal share about why she's willing to risk everything for a free Iran. We'll leave today with the words of Bob Marley. Love me some Bob. Better to die fighting for freedom than be a prisoner all the days of your life. Love you guys. Go out and make it a great day.